Introduce the panel, who was a think tanker with the IEA, but is now economics editor at The Spectator. She's gone legit. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you all know, leader of the House of Commons, and Daniel Boxall is media campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. And we will be joined by Stephen Bush, political editor of the New Statesman, in just a few moments' time, once he gets his pass. So he will be joining us very, very soon. So let's start off by getting to the nub of things and ask you, is the Tory party still the party of low tax, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Yes, absolutely, and it must be. That the Conservative Party has always had a tension within it between sound money and low taxation. We have always believed that we need to ensure that in the end the books balance, and we recognise that borrowing is merely tax deferred. And therefore, if you borrow endlessly, somebody will have to pay for it in the end. And indeed, if you go into Ricardian equivalence, you recognise that actually borrowing in place of tax doesn't have a beneficial economic effect because people are clever enough to realise that it does exactly the same to them whether you borrow or you have taxation. On the other hand, as a nation, we need to live within our means. And that means tax, which is now at about the highest level it's been since the war, the forecast of tax percentage of GDP. But it's very hard to get it above that level. Even Harold Wilson, with 98% tax rates, did not manage to get the tax take much above 38% of GDP. So there is almost an automatic limit of taxpayers' own devising. So the Tories should always work and do work with the grain of the good sense of the British people, and that means constantly aiming for lower taxation.
But you now have the highest tax burden since the Second World War.
That's exactly what I just said. And I think that that is something that we have got because of our belief in sound money and in maintaining the balance that you need to have in terms of what you borrow and what you spend and what you raise in taxation. But that we must always be looking to ensure the money spent by the state is spent efficiently and the tax burden is reasonable. And we are at the upper reaches of the reasonableness of the tax burden.
Could you foresee circumstances where it went even further, though?
Well, what's so interesting is that even when tax rates have been considerably higher, the tax take has not been much higher. And this is where you get into the issues around Laffer and so on, that there is a point at which you set higher rates and you get less tax. And that's why I said earlier, Harold Wilson with 98% tax rates could not get tax as a percentage of GDP consistently above 38% of GDP. So why on earth would you think that higher rates in the 2020s will have a greater effect than it did in the 1960s and the 1970s? Therefore, I think we are at about the limit of what taxation can raise.
But that's an argument for lower taxes now, not higher taxes, because if the argument is that lower taxes produce more economic activity, which then in turn produce a bigger tax take, why have you put up taxes?
That is a very strong argument, but it's all about balance, isn't it? And the Laffer curve is, if we take that as our starting point, is something that most of us in this room have broadly agreed upon. At 0% you raise nothing, and when you get over 100% you pretty quickly start raising nothing. There is a sweet spot at which you raise the most tax to pay for public services that you need at the lowest rate. Unfortunately, nobody has worked out what that rate is, and you have to get to it by trial and error.
Kate?
So the trial and error for the Conservative Party is going to be to raise taxes further. And if the highest tax burden in nearly 70 years is what the Conservative Party still calls low tax, I would really hate to see what a high tax Conservative Party might do. I think it's a very important point that Jacob raises, that there's a trade-off between fiscal responsibility and tax rises. We're coming out of a pandemic. The effect of that pandemic is severe. We haven't even begun to discover the consequences of tens of thousands of children dropping out of school, 5.6 million people on NHS waiting lists, and the health secretary thinks it's going to go higher. And you're completely right to say that we can't just borrow all that money. So it might be fair to say that at the moment the Conservatives, or the Treasury at least, is trying to be the party of fiscal responsibility. That is not the same thing as saying that you're the party of low tax. And I do not think it's credible for the Conservative Party, after breaking its manifesto on tax rises, to say that they're still the party of low tax. That can't just be a statement, it has to be proven, and at the moment we're very, very far away from anything, I think, that looks like low taxes.
But you've identified all the problems there, but you haven't identified a solution, because if you want to keep low taxes, then you have to increase borrowing. There are only two sources of money, aren't there?
There's one more, and that's a pro-growth agenda. You can raise money by increasing taxes. You can deal with money by having different priorities and cutting spending and austerity. You can borrow the money, but I would say that's not a particularly legitimate way to go when our current deficit looks as it does. We're in dangerous territory. Or you can go for a pro-growth agenda, and you can boost the economy. You can vitalize business, you can bring in more revenue that way, and a lot of that goes hand in hand with cutting taxes often, making it easier to employ people, not increasing national insurance for employers and employees. I think it's all good and well for the Tory party, which they haven't done, by the way, to say, here is our full agenda. We are hiking taxes in the short term, like Margaret Thatcher did. We plan to reduce them at this date because we want to go for a growth agenda, but that's not what the Conservatives are doing. And I think, it would be a challenge to even on one hand really list out the true pro-growth policies that we've seen from this government. So a lot of the rhetoric's there, but the action isn't.
Well, in the previous session, we had Deanna Davison, one of the backbencher MPs that voted against the national insurance hike, and she said that the Tory party is saying they're not the low tax party, they're the lower tax party, which I think shows you all you need to know is that they're already briefing not that they're the low tax party, but lower, which shows that they're moving towards a sort of different type of conversation around taxation. And, we found today, we did some polling, and we found that more people trust the Labour Party on taxation than the Conservative Party now, which I think shows you quite a lot about what the public think about the...
Who were you polling?
It was a large share of
Can you
people.
imagine Fiona Bruce saying that?
Yes. In fact, working people almost even more so found that they don't trust they don't trust the Conservative Party on taxation. It was only 22% compared to the national 32%. So it seems like the public have already started to agree with this message that the party of traditionally low taxation is moving away from that. And I think when we're in a situation well, as Jacob says, we've got the 70-year high tax burden. Where is that going to go? What's going to happen next? Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining
You
us.
turned up at a brilliant moment because I was about to come to you, even if you weren't there. I'll let you get your coat off first. Jacob, do you just want to...
Sorry, I was going to finish my point. And the thing I want to ask Jacob is, where is the Conservative Party going next? Is this the level that we're going to have it at, or is in the budget we're going to increase taxes even more? What's the sort of plan for the Conservative Party?
Just before I come to Jacob, Stephen, the question is the Tory party still the party of low taxes? So gather your breath, and I'll come to you in a second. Jacob.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think Kate makes a very good point about what Margaret Thatcher did. Margaret Thatcher did raise taxes. Everyone remembers the 1981 budget, and then they were then very significantly decreased because we had economic growth, because we had supply-side reforms. Now, we must have supply-side reforms. This is the Brexit dividend. We must get to a position where we are reducing the burdens on business. This is fundamental, and allow them to grow. And we've started doing things. It's fascinating how a little bit of pressure suddenly makes you realise what ridiculous rules that we have got in this country, many of which came from the European Union. Favourite one to highlight at the moment is that elderly people like me are allowed to drive a trailer on the back of our cars. But the mere youths in front of me who passed their driving test after 1997 are not allowed to.
Really?
Yes, really. And you have to take a specific extra test to drive a trailer if you passed your driving test recently, whereas, as I say, if you passed it some time ago, you don't. We have got all these barnacles on the boat, to coin a phrase, that make our economy less efficient. And the thing about the supply-side reforms that we need is that it's not going to be one big EU regulation that is knocked aside like one of those cooling towers coming down with a little explosion. It's going to be hundreds and hundreds of detailed regulations that are removed. So we need that growth agenda. We need, dare I say it, whisper it quietly, because I don't want to upset you all on the first day of the conference, but we need planning reform, because that is one of the great restraints to growth. I mean, thank heavens for our new culture secretary, who I know is a friend of yours and is a great lady, saying that monstrosity could be blown up, that all our heritage experts were desperate to keep. That's the sort of loony planning law that we need tough-minded politicians to deal with. I think 20,000 jobs were being risked because of some concrete block that English Heritage, as they used to be called, said should be listed. Thank heavens for Nadine.
Do we not need some, should we say, ministers with a bit more spine in the Treasury, though, who might reverse the IR35 legislation and might abolish the loan charge? Because, I mean, we have a HGV driver shortage now for many reasons, but one of the reasons is IR35, where it's just not worth people continuing. And yet it's Conservative ministers who've implemented this because they will not stand up to Treasury officials or indeed HMRC.
You might think that I couldn't possibly comment.
Had to try. Stephen.
Well, I was going to say, and sorry I arrived so late, I was going to say that I was in that queue for my pass so long that I think Gordon Brown was Prime Minister when I started. And looking at the tax burden, perhaps he still is. But there's actually a serious point here, which is low tax relative to what? Compared to Harold Macmillan in the 1950s? Of course. Compared to Margaret Thatcher up until 1987? Of course. Compared to George Osborne in 2015? Obviously not. The question, of course, for you is, are you the low tax party compared to the Labour Party? Yes. The difficult electoral question is, are you the low tax party for the average working age voter, given the tuition fees, which I think you can make a great sort of distributional argument for, but they are a form of income tax. UC taper rate, a form of income tax. This slightly strange thing where you have a 60p rate from 120k to 160k, but apparently it's only 160, then the disincentives to earn more kick in. Right? These are all, kind of, I would say, big both electoral risks, and also they're big economic risks, right? We do have a situation where large chunks of the working age population are disincentivized from having children, unable to afford many luxuries at a time when, for a variety of reasons, coming out of the pandemic, the dislocation as we transition out from being an economy in the single market to one outside of it, the extra costs that come with net zero. So I think it is a problem, right? But ultimately, what the choice before you exiting the pandemic is, do you want to be a fiscally conservative party, which if you are, you have to either cut spending, which I don't think would be a particularly painless experience for you electorally, or you have to become a party of higher taxes. And visibly, what the government has chosen is that they are a fiscally hawkish party before they are a low tax party. But of course, low high tax is always relative, historically speaking, right? If someone walked in from 1956 and they heard a bunch of us complaining about marginal rates of 60%, they'd go, wow, the socialists lost.
How does the Labour Party respond to this, though? Because in a sense, Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson have stolen a lot of Labour Party clothes over public spending in the past couple of years for obvious reasons. I mean, adopting, in some ways, John McDonnell's economic policy. How does Keir Starmer react to this?
Well, I think actually, if you're a local authority, you don't feel like the spending times are here to come. And if you are a social care provider, you don't feel like the good times are here to come. And now, maybe this is the first government in British political history since the creation of the NHS to put money into it and successfully get it back out again. Strange things have happened in the last decade, but it doesn't feel all that likely. And I think that the real risk, right, is that no one is ever going to vote for Keir Starmer's Labour Party because they are more enthused by him than they are by Boris Johnson. But you can see how the political space opens up for them to go, this guy, he's fun. He's basically Alex Wickham. Not Alex Wickham. Alex Wickham's a journalist. George Wickham. George Wickham from Prime Minister. I'm Fitzwilliam Darcy. I'm dull. I'm reliable. There's been a lot of promises and haven't been kept. Your taxes have gone up, but your services haven't got better. And this is why I think, the important thing about this reshuffle is the Prime Minister has clearly put people in who he thinks can deliver. And he'd better hope he's right, because if at the end of this people just look at their pay slips, but the state is still not delivering, then that is Labour's opportunity, is to fight the next election, essentially saying the Conservatives have diffused that very potent weapon of going, we're for low taxes, and going, but unfortunately they're for high taxes and crap public services, which is not a great place to be in politically.
Now, you don't have to ask about the economy. You can ask any question you like, frankly. Our panel, I'm not sure will welcome that, but anyway, let's go to the gentleman there first, and then someone over here afterwards.
Thank you, Ian. Jacob has just talked about a tension in the Conservative Party between low taxes and fiscal responsibility. We've managed to get ourselves into a place where not only we've got high taxes, but we're also printing large amounts of money. So the idea that we are being fiscally conservative when we are printing so much money, I think is for the birds. And I just want to ask Jacob how he thinks we can get out of this situation that we found ourselves in.
George Osborne managed to work things very well by being fiscally conservative and having a very loose monetary policy run by the Bank of England, which worked extremely well in getting us out of the 2008-2009 crisis. The loose monetary policy has continued not just in the UK but around the world since, and the period of recovery from, I suppose, sort of 2014 to the pandemic beginning in 2020 was not used to tighten monetary policy. And indeed, the quantitative easing remains at record levels. And then there was a further dollop that came on because of the crisis. So I think we're at £880 billion of quantitative easing, which does present all sorts of challenges. It presents challenges to the government in terms of the effect in interest rate rises because it shortens the yield curve, so an interest rate rise feeds through to the annual profit and loss account much faster than it would on the straight duration of the bonds that we've issued. This is a matter, though, for the Bank of England. They have been given independence. They were given independence in 1997 by Gordon Brown, but endlessly printing money usually has inflationary consequences. And if we're also facing supply-side challenges, then that begins to make you think that inflation is quite a risk, in which case it is all the more important to be fiscally responsible, because if you're loose on the fiscal side and on the monetary side, and you've got a supply-side problem, then you really do have a risk of inflation. So I think what you're saying slightly points to why there is the tightening fiscal stance.
Kate, just on inflation, do you think inflation is about to let rip? Because, I mean, Jacob and I can remember the inflation of the 1970s, and I was looking around the conference today. It's actually, I think, a much younger demographic at this conference. And I know when I speak to my producers about inflation, their eyes glaze over. They think, well, what's the problem? It's sort of like 2 or 3%. But you, having studied economics, you know the dangers of inflation. Do you think we're about to experience high inflation again?
I don't know if it's going to explode. Nobody does. But I'm going to defend the Treasury a bit here. There were very few politicians, or indeed economists, that at the start of the year wanted to talk about inflation. Indeed, they laugh you out of the room if you talked about it. They just said, this is the new normal. Turns out you can borrow almost an infinite amount of money and there are no consequences. One of the only politicians who didn't seem to believe that was the Chancellor, and that was lucky for us because you have to understand the tax rises from the March budget, not the NI hike, as ones that were designed to make sure that there was a cushion that if inflation and interest rates went up by even 1 percentage point, it could cost billions of pounds and it could become more difficult to service our debt. That puts us in a very difficult situation. And the Chancellor was trying to hedge against that. Now, some people would make the argument that 2 or 3% inflation is actually ideal. That's how you tackle our spiraling debt. But the problem, I think it was Milton Friedman, might have been Hayek, really shouldn't get them confused, not in this tent, who said that once, I think it was Hayek, who said that it's like a tiger. Once it's out of the bag, once the cat's out of the bag, you can't catch it. I think even something like 4 or 5% inflation, and the Bank of England now thinks it'll peak over 4% and stay that way into the middle of next year, is going to be very painful. Couple it with rising energy costs regardless because of the gas shortage internationally, couple it with tax hikes coming in and the freeze to the personal allowance. The cost of living crisis is one of the biggest threats to this government. And as Stephen says, you don't need a fantastic, charismatic Labour Party. You just need one that looks fairly competent. If the promise of the Conservative Party was that you would be better off down the road once you elected them, and that hasn't been delivered. And just one more point, because Jacob said it's a matter for the Bank of England, and that is true technically, and in many respects the Bank of England is independent and they set interest rates, but we're going to feel it. If this huge bet of hundreds of billions of pounds of QE goes terribly wrong, if inflation does explode and the bank has to quite severely raise interest rates, there are people who have mortgages who have never experienced anything like an interest rate hike. As you say, Anne, there are entire generations who just do not understand the consequences of what happens and who are going to see their savings just inflated away. This is a huge gamble. It's not unique to the UK. It's one that essentially all Western countries are having to face now. But we are vulnerable. We, as Jacob says, did not use not great times, but slightly better times to repair the roof. Our finances have held up in another crisis, but let's stop pretending that they don't come along. We've had 2 major crashes in 12 years. We don't know what the next one will be. We don't know what triggers it. And at some point, it's becoming increasingly clear we don't live in a new normal. There isn't a magic money tree, and something's got to give.
Stephen, Kate mentioned there a cost of living crisis. Of course, Ed Miliband used to bang on about that when he was Labour leader. There wasn't a cost of living crisis in those days, but there is an approaching one. The Labour Party doesn't seem to be making the most of it. The conference last week, I was flabbergasted at how few Labour spokesmen and spokeswomen tried to ram that point home. So few of them did.
Yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it? I mean, I think in some ways they did make the most of the fact the headlines were elsewhere, to have a big internal fight, break a lot of China in a situation which, unless Keir Starmer had taken to the stage with a jerry can and said, I have a lot of petrol in here, and then set it on fire, they weren't going to get much attention. So I think it was probably a good time for them to turn in on themselves. Just as David Cameron did a lot of very sensible things when the tension was elsewhere. Just sometimes it's good for opposition parties to have the fight. But I guess I would push back against the idea there wasn't a cost of living crisis in the first half of, in the Cameron era. But of course, there was this very helpful thing, which was the fuel price collapsed, right? And part of the issue is, are there going to be benign global wins? Probably not. That once and for all deflationary impact of China entering the global market doesn't, I mean, unless there's sort of a hidden second China that no one's told me about, that's probably not going to happen. But yeah, I think it was the big source for optimism for all of you in this tent is that the Labour Party has definitely failed to find a theme. Had huge announcements, very little and really would have sounded strange coming out of anyone from Jeremy Corbyn to Nick Clegg's mouth. And as long as they remain this kind of amorphous, kind of soft left blob, you'll probably be fine.
John.
John Strafford, Beaconsfield. The Taxpayers Alliance does a fantastic job in pointing out the waste of government expenditure, and yet very rarely do members of Parliament ever talk about cutting expenditure. So which items of expenditure would you cut, and would you simplify the tax system so that it benefits most of all the poorest people rather than the very rich?
Danielle.
Well, it's not really an item of spending that I'd like to see cut, but one area that I think would be a great way to start, particularly for this Conservative government, is to end national pay bargaining, which would really help with their sort of levelling up agenda, because at the moment we have a sort of national pay sort of system which makes it very difficult for different regions to set their own levels of pay in the public sector. And this is a bad thing for areas of the poorer areas, because it means that the public sector sucks up all the labour market in that area, because they are able to offer higher wages because they're sort of balanced out. So it means that small businesses aren't able to compete. So that would be a fantastic way of promoting growth, as Kate said, that pro-growth agenda. But also it's bad in areas like London, where places like the NHS, they can't compete on higher wages because there's also a cap as well. There's a little bit of extra room, the real room they have for sort of London waiting. But they don't have that sort of extra capacity, so they end up relying on industry staff or agency staff who are very expensive, and they tend to move around a lot, so that expertise doesn't stay in the public sector and a lot of information is lost. So I think a very good way for the government to start would be by ending the national pay bargaining.
Stephen?
I mean, I'm not sure if this counts as me defending the Cameron government, but I think the idea that you haven't cut public spending by quite a lot over the last decade is a myth. I wouldn't cut any further, right? I'm sorry, at some point, you as a party do have to face up to the fact that you have hugely in office further disincentivized people having kids, which, as far as I understand it, I'm not a population growth expert, but as I understand it, childbirth is quite an important part to how population sustains itself. You are going to have to deal with the fact that almost every local authority cannot meet it, increasingly can barely meet its statutory obligations. Now, yes, if it does look like the sort of belief that low interest rates were this indefinite new normal and central banks have not purged the disease of inflation from the global economy, yes, that does mean then that has implications for how much you raise in tax. But I think, look, if you were to try to continue with the quite austere and quite radical budgets you had in in your first decade in power, you would struggle to continue in office for another decade, I think, on that trajectory.
Kate?
I suppose transport infrastructure is one of the first things I'd look at. Yeah, gotta scrap HS2. It's absolutely ridiculous that remains on the books.
But it's too late.
Well, it's not too late. I mean, I think this is the sunk cost fallacy. We could be saving billions and billions and tens of billions of pounds if we were to scrap it
But
now.
the construction has already started.
Sunk cost fallacy. I mean, yeah, we have. Let's acknowledge, the Conservative Party needs to acknowledge that the idea itself was completely backwards. It was going to be irrelevant by the time it came on board. We have already wasted billions. We have already wasted money with construction. Let's not continue with a ridiculous piece of transport that is more of a grandstanding project than it is
Right, let's have
practical.
a poll. How many would scrap HS2? And how many wouldn't?
Interesting. No, higher for not scrapping than I thought.
I'm interviewing Grant Shapps on the conference stage tomorrow, so that was very
But,
useful.
can I say, transport infrastructure is an interesting one as well because it's an area where the public sector, I think, is going to want, the private sector is going to want to get more involved than it would have done before the net zero commitment. You have a lot of industry out there with a lot of money backing it that realizes that their future is in electric cars and upgrading the transport systems to be greener and more sustainable, and I think there's more private money than the state is acknowledging. And also quickly, on your point, it's not always about the amount of spending, but how efficient it is, and whether or not it's actually going to something good. So, for example, let's take this £20 top-up for universal credit. I think you can make a compelling case as the Conservative Party that the amount of money being spent shouldn't necessarily go, but it would make much more sense to lower the taper and to make work pay in a meaningful way than it would to be to keep that £20 a week handout. So a lot of it comes down to how the money's actually being spent and where it's going, as opposed to just slashing it all together.
Right, gentleman here, then the gentleman over there, and it is allowed for ladies to ask questions. You will be the next one. Right, here.
Hi. My question is regards to, so I work for a US software company, and they're looking to think about where their European offering is going to be, right, the new office. Easy with APAC, right, Singapore, for obvious reasons, you can think through that. I'm trying to make the case for London, but because of some of the optics around Brexit, right, which I kind of with in terms of the deregulation that you talked about, the potential there, because I'm not seeing any of that yet, it's hard for me when he says, well, surely we should do it in Amsterdam. So what kind of arguments do you think I should be putting to my boss to say, let's do it here?
I don't think I came to you in that last question, did I?
You didn't.
No, well, I think I let you off there, didn't I? So would you like to do that and then answer?
You want me to do both?
Yes.
All right. Okay. In saving, in my direct area of responsibility as Leader of the House, there is the proposal for restoration and renewal of the House of Commons, which I got told on the back of the cigarette packet valuation could be 10 to 20 billion pounds. I mean, look, I love the House of Westminster as much as anybody, but it is not worth 10 to 20 billion pounds of public expenditure. It needs the wiring doing, it needs the sewage doing. I can tell you all about the sewers if you want to know. And it needs the basic works done, but it does not need covered courtyards and a underground delivery system so that you don't have any lorries on the first floor delivering the fish to the catering department. It does not need to spend huge amounts of taxpayers' money, but it needs to be done properly. And I think you want to look at that type of saving. I thought Kate made two brilliant points. The sunk cost fallacy is one of the worst effects on all government spending, because if you're a politician and you've backed some scheme and £1 billion has been wasted, it is very hard to say, let's save the 9 billion more that is about to be spent and lose the billion. The political reality is that that is very difficult, but actually it is exactly the decision that should be made. If money's been spent badly, you scrap the thing, you don't say you carry on spending till you're blue in the face. Now, fortunately, HS2 is a marvellous scheme, and Grant Shapps will explain why when he's on the stage tomorrow. But the other thing Kate said that I really strongly agree with is the taper rate on universal credit. You see, I believe LAFA works whether you are receiving benefits or you're earning, and that the rate at which your earnings are taken away, percentage-wise, has the same incentive for you if you're a low earner on the universal credit or you're a high earner paying the top rate of tax. And I think it's, I never remember it's 62 or 63%. 63% withdrawal rate. That is a rate that provides a much greater incentive than the over 90% it was beforehand, but the latter argument must apply. So I think there are savings to be found. If you are, and most of you are in this tent, low-tax conservatives, then the choice is spending or taxing. And I think individuals spend their money better than the government spends it for them. And therefore, the government should spend less, and the British people should keep more of their own money to spend for themselves. And we should deliver our services better so that the money is more effectively spent. In brackets, GPs should give face-to-face appointments, close brackets. And to come to setting up a business, I don't believe that governments create businesses. I believe we create the conditions where business can take place and can thrive and prosper. And that is our Brexit challenge. If I may talk about my own business, which I set up in 2007. In 2007, it was incredibly easy to set up a financial services business dealing with institutional clients. I was up and running and managing money within 6 weeks of having left my former employer. If under the AIFMD, MiFID rules, etc., that have come in the 14 years since then, I were to try again, the costs would be several times more, because the startup costs were basically, the founders didn't take any money to start with, we just had to pay a couple of people, and once we moved out of my basement, find an office. So it's the costs that have been imposed by self-imposed regulation. And we have to be able to say to your investor, come here because it is the best place to invest, because we're not going to tie you down with endless regulations and make the doing of business difficult. And recognise that is the government's role, creating the platform for business, not creating the specific business or choosing favourites or any of those sorts of things.
But what about the Brexit side of it?
I mean, in the Brexit side of it, that most trade arrangements are goods rather than services anyway. The services arrangements within the EU are still less than ideal, and therefore if you're selling services, unless people apply capital controls, it's very difficult to stop services being transferred across borders.
Well, in terms of that specific point, right, this is obviously the biggest reason why the government having a successful climate conference is important is that, I would prefer not to die in the climate wars. But the other reason why it's important is an opportunity for the government to show a different side of itself when the vast majority of international capitals do kind of regard Brexit in the same bracket still as the various sort of populist and anti-system uprisings that we've seen since the financial crisis. So having a successful COP is important for this government's objective in terms of attracting business as well, I think, as, us not all dying in the climate wars. But it's difficult. I think I think ultimately, I say to someone who did not vote for Brexit and any of the opportunities that have been presented to do so electorally since 2016. Ultimately, it's not like the systems uprisings that we see throughout Europe, including here. It is different. And I think part of the challenge for this government is just demonstrating that through things like having a successful conference, demonstrating its respect for the rule of law, et cetera, because actually, although there are real economic costs of being outside for goods, as Jacob says, right, it is just different for services. And one consequence of us leaving is that the services market is never going to complete itself now, so it doesn't really matter, right?
So in terms of making Britain a best place for business, I think one thing that the government could be doing is they're increasing corporate tax to 25% next year. So I think if that was to be lowered, I think that would encourage businesses to stay in this country. I also think the super deduction is a very good idea for encouraging businesses to invest. Again, it's another pro-growth policy, which Kate mentioned. But I'd like to come back to something that Jacob said about it's good to have, for Britons to keep more of their money in their back pocket. Well, Jacob, you were one of the people that mentioned that in the cabinet meetings as reported. I was just wondering why you weren't able to convince other members of the cabinet about that argument.
You see, I'm afraid some of you may have noticed, the more observant among you, that I'm relatively old-fashioned, and cabinet conversations are confidential, so I cannot say. But if you wait 30 years, it will be revealed. But I'm sorry, I won't betray confidences.
You've really learnt the art, haven't you?
No, I'm a bit stuffy, and I won't.
We get that.
I'm very careful not to say what's gone on in the cabinet. It's private. I know this is an unusual view, but
I am very hopeful that the UK will take advantage of the opportunities that Brexit has put forward to make a more competitive and vibrant economy and a friendlier one for business. I'm not terribly optimistic. So far, and granted, we want to give the government credit here, they've had other things on their mind. But before COVID hit, back in winter 2020, January, February time, what did we see the government doing around changes to Brexit rules? Well, they were talking about increasing state aid. They were talking about bailing out Flybe. They were talking about not in any way embracing the market, but using the state to protect industry. Now, you can make the case for that, but that certainly wasn't the case that I was hearing from the Brexiteers, those who are now in cabinet, when they were campaigning to leave the European Union. This was always one of the benefits of Brexit, in my opinion, that we could have these conversations. Do we want a more protectionist state? Do we want a more international one? Do we want more state intervention, or do we want to let businesses do their thing? This is the conversation we were going to have. I just didn't realize it was going to be so contained to the Conservative Party and to the leaders who very much seem to be on one side of the debate, who then found themselves in a position of power and thought, oh, actually, turns out in the polls, at least it is popular to give a few more freebies and to give a few more handouts. I haven't seen much in the way of taking advantage of Brexit yet, but Jacob may tell me that it's all coming down the road. The government has been very busy dealing with the pandemic, and maybe that's what 2022 is about, when growth figures at the moment are forecast to be off the charts. Some of the tax hikes haven't come in yet. Maybe we're all living quite a good life next year before 2023 hits and the spending cuts come in and the tax hikes come in and growth falls back to being something really stagnant, and everyone looks at the Conservative Party and says, what have you done? Maybe, Jacob, next year's the year where they do it all and make the situation a bit better.
Just on that, let me just go right down the panel. How long do you think it is reasonable to wait until we can actually judge whether Brexit has been a success? Because, I mean, a lot of people, any of you who are on Twitter, the Remainers are back in force. I never use that word because I think it's really disrespectful. But you're right. But at some point, people will have to make a judgment on whether it was all worthwhile, not just from an economic point of view, but all sorts of other reasons as well. Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Jacob?
it's already. It's immediate because our vote counts. We now choose our government for ourselves, and people like me can't say...
Well, we always have.
No, we haven't, because all our laws were coming in from Europe.
No.
And so if we were to discuss this ridiculous regulation that I mentioned a moment ago about pulling trailers, I could say, oh, nothing I can do, not my business, you may have elected me, I may be a member of Parliament, nothing I can do, Governor, you move along quietly. And that was sort of true of agriculture, it was true of trade. Every bit of trade we've done is done because we can now do it for ourselves. But it's not so much that we're using it to do good things or using it to do bad things. It's that your vote counts. We are back to being a democracy. And you, ladies and gentlemen, will make the choices for your country. And people like me will be involved in that by putting ourselves forward. But that's what's always been so exciting about Brexit. It's getting back a proper functioning democracy from which decisions can be made. It's not actually about the decisions that are then made, because that's up to the voters to determine who they put in place to do that. And they decided last time round to have Boris Johnson rather than Jeremy Corbyn, and that was clearly the right choice to make. So I think we can have confidence in the voters, and it's already working.
Kate?
I'm inclined to agree with that. I think, though, there's a difference between saying whether or not Brexit was a success and whether or not Boris Johnson's Brexit deal was a success. Because I agree with Jacob that we got to a point in politics where we weren't sure whether or not the result of a referendum was going to be carried out, and that could have been truly catastrophic to the fabrics of the nation. And so the fact that it was carried out is a win in itself. But what happens to Northern Ireland is a huge question that's going to define Boris Johnson's Brexit. And I think we're probably going to know that in the next 5 years. We'll certainly have a strong indication. What happens when the Assembly votes to keep the protocol or not, that will be a huge element of the judgment. So for me, that's what I'll be looking for.
Danielle, Remainers will say, well, it's all very well to say you've recovered the ability to govern yourselves, But what about any potential economic damage? How can we assess it in those terms and maybe offset the sovereignty issues against the economic issues?
Yeah, well, it's very easy to say that, Brexit was the cause of X or Brexit was the cause of Y, and I think people tend to blame it because there's, no easy way of seeing in the potential alternative universe what would have happened had we did vote to remain. So I think, the question, how long is it going to take to determine whether it was a success or not, is kind of a impossible question to answer, because it's not really about whether Brexit itself was a success, but whether what the government used the opportunity or not to improve the conditions of this country, and the sort of deregulation aspects that Jacob talks about, whether the government actually sort of harnessed that with both hands and go forward with that is, I think, what the real question is, and I think that will be decided at the next election.
Well, I think it's both now and it's never, right? Ultimately, yeah, the economic point is important, but if you really care only about the economy, you would have left the customs union, stayed in the single market, signed trade deals with anyone who would have you, but that would have major implications for the ability of the elected government of this country to make meaningful decisions, because the calculation and trade-off in any trade arrangement, and one of the problems I would say the Conservative Party is perhaps at risk of developing is a weird neuralgia where it's fine if you lose sovereignty in one trade deal, provided it's not in Europe, as opposed to going, well, look, there's always a trade-off about the value of your sovereignty versus what you get out in terms of the benefits or the economic benefits of losing some of it. But the benefit of maximising your sovereignty, which is the form of Brexit we have currently chosen, right? They materialise the second you do that. The argument is never settled, right? The 2016 American election was in large part about the consequences of NAFTA, a trade deal which had been signed 2.5 decades prior, right? In many ways, you could say, well, when did our housing crisis start? Well, it started with the 1948 Planning and Housing Bill. It started with right to buy, right? The nature of politics is there are no permanent defeats or permanent victories. To quote Tony Benn in the IEA tent, to live a little dangerously for a second. But yeah, it's either now or it's never.
Tony Benn always told me I was his favourite Thatcherite entrepreneur, and I said, well, how many do you know, Tony? Right, where's he gone? There.
COVID showed that the birth rate of the country went down rather than up. This is what displaying the stresses that people are suffering from a failed marketplace in energy, housing, and council taxes. We are so overburdened that people are making those sort of choices not to have children. Now, I think your issue that you might be addressing is how do we help families? Could we not actually give married people allowance, which is substantial enough to encourage people to have children?
Talking of knocking out children, Jacob.
Well, I'm glad to say my wife is in the audience, who is the
Well, I wouldn't have said that.
it's the major participant in this great activity and enterprise. The more the merrier. But I think the Prime Minister and I are leading by example in this area. I'd be jolly keen to lead by even further example, but I think Mrs. Rees-Mogg is not so keen. However,
she nodded, by the way.
For the record, leaving that to one side, how does a government and should a government encourage people to have children, or should it be neutral? I mean, I think the government ought to support the family because we see that a strong family provides good and successful outcomes for children. And there's a great deal of good work that's been done by Ian Duncan Smith on this subject and the Centre for Social Justice. But we don't want to fall into the 1990s trap that we fell into of being very judgmental about how people lead their lives. So that's the balance that we've got to try and get right. So we need to help people, encourage families, recognise the importance of families, but not lecture and judge. And if we can do that, then we'll be providing supportive policy for families.
I'm going to ask for briefer answers so we can rattle through a few more before we end. Stephen?
I mean, look, you're not going to incentivise families with a tax cut for married couples. Like, the numbers simply don't add up. The problem is that we have incredibly expensive childcare, and for a variety of governments of different colours, we now have a weird situation where if you're poor, then you have 3-year-olds, but you don't have 2-year-olds, and if you're earning above a certain amount, you don't have 3-year-olds, but you do have 2-year-olds because you get free childcare for that, and it's just a mess, right? And whether that's market failure, state failure, or a bit of the two, but if you want to encourage people to have the number of children they have to have, you cannot have a situation in which people essentially are losing money hand over fist, and they can't afford either to be a single or a dual earner couple and have the family lives they want to be. And that's why, it's fine. I'm allowed to say you've got to fix planning because you can't vote against my planning reforms. I don't have any. But you've got to fix planning and childcare, the cost of childcare, rather than thinking that you can fiddle it by like 1-2%, or unless you're just going to say if you're married you don't pay any tax at all, which I'm not going to say no to you getting all of my money back, but you can't fix that stuff solely with tax incentives.
Well, in Hungary, if you've got 4 children, you pay no income tax. Which is quite attractive from my point of view.
What's the average?
In fact, you'll be getting a rebate.
What's the average age in which a woman in the UK has her first child? Is it 28?
I think it's over 30 now.
Is it over 30 now? Well, I'm not surprised to hear that. I think it was 28 not that long ago, and I remember thinking about it because when I was 28, that was the first opportunity I had. I was in a position for the first time to be able to afford to rent a box studio by myself. I had been living in a house with 5 other people up until that point. I challenge a few of your premises about market failure in energy and childcare. These are between price caps and serious regulations that make it near impossible to make money in these sectors. I think it's state intervention that's made a lot of these price tags go up. But we need a housing revolution. I mean, that is the fundamental issue for young people. How can you imagine having a family and children when you are still living with 6 of your friends in your late 20s? As fun as that might sound, it gets less fun, and it's not by choice. It's because you really can't afford in certain parts of the country, often where the higher paying jobs are, to do anything else. So until you reform the planning system, as Stephen says, I don't really see how you can claim to be all that family friendly.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a question of sort of, incentivizing through tax cuts. I mean, when you think that the bottom 10% of of earners, they already have to pay over half of their gross income in tax. So it means that they don't have enough money in their pocket to pay for essentials. And it goes back to what Jacob was saying, is that it's better to have people, keeping more of their money in their back pockets rather than it being taken away in taxation. So I think instead of, incentivizing some people and sort of taking it away from others, I think a fairer system and a lower system for all would be the best way to encourage people to have more children.
Okay. Lady over.
Hi. One thing I will say, just to add into the child thing, is 1 in 4 kids in the UK live in poverty, so that may also be kind of incentive not to have children. But more broadly, when we talk about universal credit, I see that...
Can you just say who you are?
Nadine.
From where?
From Yahoo News. So I just wanted to ask, basically, do you think that the taper rate will help people that necessarily aren't working on universal credit? Because at the moment, the £20 uplift isn't really dependent on whether or not you're working at all. Whereas if you're disabled, for example, and you're unable to work, a taper rate really isn't going to help you very much. And also, just back to the idea that it's a handout or something like that. Say, for example, you're somebody who's claiming universal credit, but you've paid taxes your whole life. Would you say that the state has an obligation, as you were a taxpayer, to support you? Or would you say, it's not a return, it's just a handout? So they're the 2 questions I would...
Kate.
Well, I think we should stop trying to treat everybody like they're on your universal credit as if they're the same. We're talking about individuals. And I think there can be exemptions or different rules within the system to cater for people who, as you say, are disabled, who might not benefit because they're not able to work. I don't think that we should let exemptions or exceptions to the rule, which are very important to deal with, take away from the overarching principle of universal credit, which I think is the right one, where the more you are working, the better off you are. So I think that principle is a very important one. But of course, you can have exemptions and you can have changes within the system. Is it a handout? Is it deserved? Look, I believe in a safety net. I suspect most people in this room do. If there's a role of the state, it's in key areas like defense, emergency, like we had in 2020, and it's to provide a safety net for when people aren't in a position where they can help themselves or their family. It may be more temporary, it may be more permanent. I think that's fundamentally a conservative principle, that you help your neighbor. And I think that's almost indisputable. So it's not a question of whether or not this person is deserving or not. Frankly, I believe in the individual, and I'm well aware that when you look at somebody, you cannot judge their experience or what they've gone through simply by looking at them. But for me, it's about creating a system in which doing things that we know make somebody feel more valued and make somebody feel better, and that is going to work, and that's working for longer. It makes you healthier. The vast majority of evidence backs that up, that we make that pay and that we make that as lucrative as possible. So I do think the focus should be there.
Danielle.
Yeah, in terms of the taper rate, I do think that there obviously are improvements that need to be made in the universal credit system. It's not a perfect system at all. But I think the main sort of point is that most people on universal credit do want to work. I mean, obviously there are some people where that doesn't apply, and I do think that it should be. If you can't work because of various reasons, as if you're disabled, then obviously there should be exemptions for that. But we have 1 million jobs available at the moment, and there's plenty of people that would like to work and need to find jobs. And I think that encouraging people to get into work is what we should be doing. So yeah, I think that the taper rate could be introduced. And in terms of is it a handout or not? No, I think it isn't a handout. I agree with Kate. I mean, there is a role for the state. Just because we're the Taxpayers Alliance and we believe in low tax doesn't mean we believe in the not existence of a state at all. And there are some places where the state should intervene. But as I say, the point is that the point of a system like that is to encourage people to get back into work, because I think the majority of Britons actually do want to work.
Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, not to sound like I'm a shill for big childcare providers, but a lot of my friends have small babies, and whenever they see me, they go, "Why don't you write about it more in the New Statesman?" So I'm going to once again shill for big childcare, which is, look, if people were disincentivised from working, most people with children in this country wouldn't. They work because they enjoy it. The taper rate is a problem, but there is a problem, and while it's true, it's great for people to have their own money, but there is, at the bottom of the labour market, you aren't going to simply fix the problem of people not having enough to get by without some form of direct financial transfers. And there are loads of reasons why people can't work. I think actually this idea that people will choose not to, I think is just not true. Being in work's great. You get to meet people and make friends, and one of the reasons why it would be good if there was slightly more encouragement to return to work and all is it is a thing that brings people joy. But we also have a social responsibility to look after people who fall under hard times, even actually if they've done things which are really irresponsible. A society should be a forgiving one as well, and not just a kind of, you've done this. One of the great things about the furlough, though, is it did recognise what people had done before, and I think that while you couldn't have it indefinitely after people were unemployed, I think it did also help protect the rest of the economy, that people's wages didn't immediately drop. So whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 4 months, I think some kind of furlough-style after-earnings benefit system is a good thing to look at moving into, particularly in times of financial crisis.
Well, I agree with much of what's already been said. I think it is crucial to understand that people are individuals and that the benefit system needs to focus on the individual, which is what the universal credit does, and indeed the personal independent payments for the disabled do. And I think specifically in relation to the disabled, one of the great objectives of policy is to see what people can do, not what they can't do, and to be positive about it. And I've had the most amazing people come to me in my constituency work who want to do things and want to maximise their abilities, and there are supports within the state system to help them get jobs. And I think this is terrific, because it's always about what people can do and valuing everybody as an individual, and not just lumping people in broad categories and then proceeding to write them off with a little bit of money. I don't think that's the answer. So I'm very pleased that we've got a more individualistic system, which is not an insurance scheme, which you asked specifically. It isn't designed like that. It is designed, as Kate was saying, to be a safety net. And I agree, there is a duty for the state to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. That's something for which we pay our taxes.
Right, final question, gentleman there.
So on media such as LBC recently, there's been coverage of meat being sold in restaurants which are halal and kosher, i.e. animals which have been slaughtered without stunning, which is my concern as to opposed to a religious issue. Yet this meat is not being labelled as non-stunned meat. So would you support a law that ensures that meat is labelled as saying whether the animal has been stunned or not? And secondly, despite evidence that fish feel pain, there is no law banning fish being slaughtered without stunning. And despite evidence that crustaceans feel pain, crustaceans may not be classed as sentient, basically allowing lobsters to still be boiled alive. So would you support crustaceans to be classed as sentient and regulation to ensure that crustaceans and fish are not slaughtered without stunning?
Well, I did say questions on anything, didn't I? So, this is quite an interesting subject, though. I mean, I've done a few phone-ins on this, and it seems to me, I'm going to alienate some people in the audience now, that halal meat should be completely banned, like it is in some other countries, Kate Andrews.
I wouldn't ban it. I think that's more an issue of religious freedom, which for me probably trumps
Why should
the other
religious
ethics.
freedom trump food standards?
It's,
or animal cruelty?
I'm not sure it's so much about the food standard. It's about the animal versus the person and their religious freedom. It's a really difficult one. I mean, I'm uncomfortable with it, and I would get very nervous about where we might tread to if we started saying that the way that your religion deems that you need to eat your meat is now outlawed in the UK. I just think we have to all think about the consequences of making a law like that. As it happens, I think lobsters should be classified as sentient. I don't know. I wouldn't say I'm indifferent to whether or not we need a law on it. I'd question, do we need a law on it? Or could we start with awareness campaigns for those who feel strongly about it? Could you not ask in your restaurant how this animal or this fish was killed, whether or not it was stunned? Do we need to put that on menus? Do we need to put that into legislation? I can't say I've given it a lot of thought. I'd question whether or not that's the first step. Is to actually put a law on it for menus. I could see that, again, moving into territory, what might the implications be?
And of course, with Brexit, we have the power to do that,
We do have the power, we can debate it.
we do indeed. I too would be reluctant to ban halal or kosher slaughter. I think religious freedom is very important, and I think in a world where relations between the various religions can sometimes be quite sensitive, and the Labour Party's had a particular issue of anti-Semitism. One doesn't want to do anything that may seem to be directed against a particular religion. And yes, there's a balance in animal rights, and it's a question of how cruel really is it. As for lobsters, I'm slightly biased because I think they taste delicious. I'm not sure that lobsters are sitting in the boiling pan reading John Locke. So I'm not, I'm afraid, as worried about lobsters as I should be.
Okay.
I mean, either you're a meat eater or not. If you're a meat eater, you've got to accept that what you eat will suffer because it's going to be killed. But we would have nothing like the amount of beef cattle that we have in this country. They would never be brought about if we weren't meat eaters. We wouldn't have all the chickens. They wouldn't live at all. There would be none of them. And if you're a meat eater, you've got to accept that the end of the life for what you're eating is going to be earlier than it would be if you carried on feeding them as if they were pets. They are not pets. They are part of the food chain, and we are at the top of the food chain, thankfully. And I enjoy
for now.
I enjoy eating meat, and I absolutely love lobster.
Danielle, I can imagine many hours are spent at the Taxpayers Alliance on this subject.
Yes, yeah, I'm rubbing my hands together.
Yes.
This is a particular area of interest for me. But I think on the broader topic, I think there's a lot of people that don't actually know where their restaurant food comes from, which is quite an interesting area of interest, because in supermarkets, all your food is labelled about where the origin comes from. So in a sort of broader aspect, I think perhaps that there could be some interest in labelling or at least advertising in restaurants about where things come from, not just if it's halal or not, but if it's British, if it's local, that kind of thing might be of interest to people. On the crustaceans thing, I remember reading something about the government looking into and perhaps also, I think, introducing a law on that. So I feel like that ship might have already sailed.
Okay, Stephen.
Well, look, so I'm not aware, as someone who's Jewish, that there is a vast degree of difference between how Muslims kill their food and how we kill ours to suggest that halal should be banned and kosher food should not. But I'm going to specifically address why I think it would be a bad idea to mandate every restaurant which chose to prepare its meat in that way to do so, which is we do in the British community face a serious, violent threat to our lives and liberty, which is why, on the 5 times a year that I bother to go to synagogue, there is a security guard outside the door. And if you make every restaurant label whether or not it has prepared its meat in a halal or kosher way, you are making every restaurant advertise itself to that violent terrorist threat that we in the British community still face. But also, I just think if people care so much about the welfare of their meat, stop eating it. But the right to religious freedom is a really important foundation of being a liberal democracy, and it also, unfortunately, in this particular liberal democracy, does have quite important safety implications. So I completely agree with, wow, I should never do these events. What's left of my left-wing credibility just completely flew out the door. But I completely agree with everything Jacob and Kate have said on this issue. I am concerned about the fact that crustaceans feel pain. I do think but I think that involves having a serious conversation in this country about eating meat and fish full stop, rather than what I'm afraid I essentially regard as sectarianism.
Well, I think my work here is done having brought Jacob and Stephen together. So on that note, thank you to Stephen, Danielle, Jacob and Kate. Thank you very much.